So one big misperception is probably when you're looking at the US market that the US is not self-sufficient in copper. The US is actually self-sufficient. The problem is just that we are not processing enough copper domestically and instead sending it abroad.
Michael, if you're sitting with Satya Nadella at Microsoft, he's got to build out 3 AI things to keep up with Perplexity and Google Gemini and all this other AI stuff I don't understand. How much copper does Satya Nadella need?
So I can give you an idea in terms of potential copper demand growth. So potential copper demand growth over the last 10 years was probably around 2% globally. With the electrification, data centers, and AI, you can justify a doubling of potential copper demand growth to around 4%. So it's quite significant.
I'd love to get a sense of the kind of dislocation that's happened since President Trump announced at that cabinet meeting the imposition of this 50% tariff, and what's going to happen between now and August 1st when I gather it goes into effect. What does it mean for the global copper market, the level of uncertainty I think that's catalyzed?
Look, there's a lot of uncertainty, but the first thing I would say after the US has outsourced a lot of its manufacturing supply chain during the globalization, it actually only has a very small share in total copper demand, global copper demand. It's around 6-7%. The biggest, I think, impact that we potentially see in the short term is really on the domestic US price, and we've already started to see a reaction. We are not quite pricing in the 50% tariff, but we are somewhere around 25 to 30% at the moment. And look, world outside China is a lot of uncertainty about tariffs and trade wars anyways. I think there you have a little bit of headwinds as well. But the biggest impact we're seeing right now is really on the US market.
Compliance would be unhappy if I asked you to psychoanalyze the president, but let me put this a different way, and if I could. That is, what does President Trump want to see happen here? So from what you're saying, the U.S. doesn't have the capacity to mine or produce copper to the scale that the president, I gather, would like. How does he see all of this playing out, and what would it take at a very basic level for the U.S. to kind of reclaim the mantle that it had, I guess, many decades ago when it was producing a lot more copper?
Look, it's an interesting one, I think, because we have gone through almost 2 years of shutting down not just copper processing capacity, but also aluminum processing capacity. And I think this is where the president then ultimately says that from a national security perspective, this is just not a good state to be in. So when he announced the aluminum tariffs, when he is now announcing the copper tariffs, I think it's relatively clear cut. What he wants to do is, in a way, boost the domestic copper price. By that, he would effectively make the consumers or the manufacturers pay a higher price. And that money then potentially goes into the pockets of the producers. And I think the hope ultimately is that with an expansion in domestic margins, you're finally getting the investment that then rebuilds the supply chain.